Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name's Namdi Iregbalem, and today I'm joined by Benedikt Stroebl. Benedikt and I met each other, I think it was January of this year, so a couple months ago now, based off of coming across one of his really interesting papers, which we'll talk about today. But just very quickly to introduce Benedikt. Benedikt is a very brilliant AI researcher who's on leave from Princeton where he's doing his PhD. But welcome, Benedikt, and why don't you kind of finish your intro?
Cool. Yeah, no, thank you, Namdi. Excited to be here. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, I'm Benedict. I'm kind of I left Princeton this year after 2 years of doing my PhD and work on like AI agents.
And so we have a couple different topics we want to touch on today, but we'll start with the one that had originally brought Benedikt and I together, which is this paper that he wrote a little while back. I guess it was last year. And so the paper that we'll start off with is called Inference Scaling Flaws, the Limits of LLM Resampling with Imperfect Verifiers. And I thought this was a really, really interesting paper. I think it's well timed to all the things happening around, inference time, scaling, test time, compute, etc. And I think the paper follows a nice sort of structure where the kind of high level is, you might think X, but it turns out Y is actually true. So maybe Benedikt kind of like talk through at a high level, kind of what is maybe the common or intuitive or belief that others might have had about inference time compute that you're kind of challenging in this paper.
Yeah, sure. No, I would love to. So maybe kind of to start off, maybe I provide a little bit of context in kind of, what conversation this paper speaks to. So like in the, AI community, I think like after the release of GPT-4, right, in March 2023, like one of the dominant narratives, I think, was that, scaling, model scaling, increasing the parameter count and the data that we do pre-training with these models with kind of will improve performance capability indefinitely. And like there were these papers coming out on the scaling laws, right, of like, scaling compute basically and data to improve performance. But then around, I think in December last year, actually, kind of there was a couple like reports and like really prominent people. I think most prominently maybe Ilya Sutskever kind of coming out and like changing or challenging that narrative a little bit, like saying the 2010s, I think was the quote, was the age of scaling, and now we're back in the age of discovery and like exploration again to find what is the next big thing to kind of to lift the frontier of what's possible in AI. And that's kind of the context a little bit of where we also got interested in like studying sort of the limits of one of these potentially next directions, which is inference time scaling. So what I mean by inference time scaling is basically increasing the amount of compute that we use to answer a query, but not during pre-training, but during inference time. So like have the model weights stay fixed, and all we do is like, give the model more compute and more time to think harder about a potential solution. I think by now, these sort of reasoning models, for example, from OpenAI, the O series of models with Cloud 3.7, Anthropic also kind of has their own reasoning model, and Gemini 2.5 Pro as another frontier reasoning model. So most of these frontier models are now actually reasoning models because there is a clear sort of like improvement in performance that we can achieve from inference time scaling. So the paper actually speaks to a very specific type of inference time scaling, which is like through repeated sampling. And this is kind of so sort of like attractive, let's say in the first place, because the idea is very simple of this form of inference time scaling. Because like everything like inference time scaling through repeated sampling, what we mean by that is basically that you have access to two things: a generator and a verifier. And the generator is like, let's say, the language model that comes up with a proposed solution to a given problem, let's say a coding problem, to implement a certain function. And then the verifier is purely tasked with judging whether this proposed solution given the task is correct or incorrect. And then, inference time scaling can then happen in this very simple setup of where the generator kind of just keeps proposing new solutions until one of them passes the verifier. And with that, that is kind of the final solution that the system, let's say this entire inference time scaling system, submits to the user who kind of had the original query. Um, Okay, so what's the problem now, and kind of what do we mean with the limits of inference scaling through resampling? I think one of the problems is that these verifiers, judging whether given candidate solutions are correct or incorrect, are very rarely in practice perfect. They're very rarely what we call an oracle verifier that does not make mistakes. One example of that is for example, in math, like we have these automated proof systems, right, that cannot like do that for any sort of math problem, but for there's a certain class of math problems where those work, and you can be sure as a user that if the automated proof system kind of compiles and tells you, okay, like this sort of proof that you wrote in a language like Lean, for example, is indeed correct or incorrect. So there's no mistakes. This is what we call an oracle verifier. But in domains outside of math, such as coding or like question answering, right? Like there is no such verifier that does not make mistakes. So that is kind of this whole class of imperfect verifiers that we mentioned in the paper. And for those, of course, the dynamics of the systems are a little bit different, right? Because there are these sort of like effects that happen, these dynamics, but a generator proposes a solution, it passes the verifier, but it's actually incorrect. So there's like this false positive basically that comes out of the system. And we just wanted to understand, and this is the entire feel of the paper, like one of the core theses, is like how do these sort of false positives, these like imperfect verifiers, um, like false positives produced by imperfect verifiers, how do those affect the value of resampling for inference scaling in the first place, right? Because like resampling, while it might be simple, it's actually a technique that is pretty widely used to also for training these reasoning models that I mentioned earlier during data collection, for example, right? Like where you kind of collect reasoning traces to train the model on in the first place. What you usually do, or like one technique that people have done, is like they have an existing model and ask it just repeatedly to kind of think about a solution, come up with one, and then they do rejection, what is called rejection sampling. So they retain sort of the thinking traces, the chain of thoughts that led to a correct solution, and put it into the data set that they can then train a reasoning model on. So resampling is used widely. So we want to understand, okay, how do imperfect verifiers affect the dynamics and the value of that approach? And then kind of high level, I'm sure we can get into more of the detailed findings, but the high level finding is actually that if we assume there is a cost of a false positive, and there's different sort of cost benefit ratios of like how sort of valuable to the user is a indeed correct solution, a true positive, versus how costly is a false positive, that oftentimes for like in real world benchmarks with real models, we find that the optimal number of samples that this setup allows us to compute is very low. It's like lower than 10. So basically, like the benefit of doing inference scaling in the first place is through resampling is very limited. And this dynamic kind of comes about. The key reason for that is that we find that there is like a strong correlation between kind of the capability of the generator model in the first place with the false positive rate of the verifier that we study here in this specific example, which are unit tests for coding problems. So basically, in other words, this means like weaker models produce false positives at a higher rate. So they tend to produce solutions at a higher rate that trick the verifier into marking them as correct, but indeed they're actually false positives. And for stronger models, like the frontier models, like GPT-4o, for example, in our paper still, we find that they produce these false positives at a lower rate, which of course also makes them more useful for doing repeated sampling, because the risk of sampling a false positive, a fluke in that sense, is just much lower.
Awesome. So yeah, there's definitely a lot there, and I want to kind of touch on a bunch of the different things that you went through. First of all, and you kind of mentioned this, but the whole notion of resampling or sampling as a way to sort of scale inference, at test time. I remember the first time I came across that, and I was like, that seems almost too simple to work. It's like in some sense it's like the simplest possible thing you could do,
Yeah.
and but as you said, sort of paired with a verifier, that is a way to essentially, in some sense, get to higher, accuracy than you would get with the sort of like, single sample, metric. And then as you were kind of discussing with these verifiers, the notion of like an Oracle verifier is it's almost like a theoretical concept. I mean, there are areas, perhaps domains where you could have one, but in the vast majority of domains, you're going to have these, imperfect verifiers. To your point, and one of the things that's interesting to me about that, and it relates to the examples in the paper, but I often find that in like casual discussions of verifiers, people oftentimes assume that coding is where you can have a perfect verifier. People talk about it like, well, if the code works,
Hmm.
then in some sense it's verified. But as you kind of talk about in the paper, it's actually it's much more subtle than that, or nuanced than that, I should say, where like a model can pass some number of unit tests, or its answers can pass some number of unit tests, but maybe not all of the unit tests in a more sort of like comprehensive evaluation. And so even in the coding context, it's often hard to get to that perfect notion of perfect verification, which I think is really, really interesting. And then you talk about, and here it might make sense to pull up what I feel like is probably one of the key figures of the paper, which is right on page one, where you kind of show the slope between single sample accuracy, so just asking the LLM for one response and taking that as being its response, versus, and this is a little bit of a mouthful, but accuracy conditional on passing human eval unit tests, which my understanding of that is kind of to what I was just saying. It's sort of like, okay, assume that it passes the initial kind of smaller set of unit tests, and then imagine you could sample a bunch from that model. What proportion of those answers would pass the more comprehensive unit test suite? Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's like I can get into in a second like how exactly we operationalize that, but what it like intuitively means is like conditional on the solution passing the verifier, in this case unit tests, right? That we wrote for like some function that we want that we task the model to like come to implement for us. Like, what is the chance that this solution passing the unit test is indeed correct in this like holistic sense, right? It's like truly functionally correct. And of course, we can never really like determine that. I mean, we can of course like reading the code and like just knowing it's correct. But like how we do it in the paper at scale is basically that we have two sets of unit tests, like a smaller set that is imperfect, has like imperfect test coverage, what people call test coverage, and then like an extended set that is like has much better test coverage, and that we just assume that this like extended set of unit tests is like like is measuring sort of like the true correctness of the solution. Although that we also point out in the paper, even that extended set of unit tests has an imperfect test coverage, so it's not entirely perfect, but like for the study, it's perfectly valid to assume sort of like to use that as our operationalization of measuring and putting these two quantities on these axes.
Yeah. And you bless us with the regression coefficients here, and it's interesting, right? Because obviously, this number is less than one, which is to say, like, as single sample accuracy increases, the uh, the infinite sample accuracy does not increase one for one, which in some sense, I guess, makes sense, because I guess if it was the opposite, then you would very quickly hit maximal accuracy
Yeah.
with infinite sampling. Um, so you don't get as much bang for a buck with the additional sampling as you get with that, first sampling. Um, and then what's interesting is like you have this line here, which is the GPT-4o's sort of single sample accuracy. And what's notable is that a bunch of these models, even with many, many, many samples, don't beat that. And
Exactly.
I guess my interpretation of that is sort of like there's some sense in which these models are effectively dominated by GPT-4o in a certain sense. Is that right?
Yes, so kind of the notion, like this is exactly correct. I think that the notion of like why this is true is the following, and that is that if you consider sort of like the conditional pass rate, so the quantity that is displayed here on the y-axis, as and you realize that this is actually the upper bound of accuracy that a given model here can achieve given infinite compute, right? Like
Mhm.
if I just if I take for example, let's say the CodeGen 2 model, which is like a quite old model by now, but like it was a model fine-tuned for like coding tasks. if I take that and it seems like to be close to like zero point 0.8 on the y-axis, and I sample like millions, billions, and like infinite number of samples from it, and I just pick one of the passing ones on my verifier, the chance of that being correct is just zero point 0.8, and this chance will not improve by sampling more models in the limit. So the thing is, because of that being correct, like actually the Cogent 2 model, even with infinite inference time compute and resampling, can never achieve and surpass the GPT-4o tacit 1 accuracy, right? Because like GPT-4o has like a chance if you sample one solution of like, closer to 0.85, this vertical line in the plot. And that can never be surpassed with any amount of compute for Cogent 2. So like there's this natural limit of the models of the dots here in the plot below that vertical line, not being able to surpass GPT-4o. And I think that's kind of, while this is like, if once you understood kind of what these axes means, kind of quite obvious and like, seems intuitive, the implications of it is actually quite interesting, right? That like this
Right.
promise of like smaller, cheaper models, we just put them into this like structure with a verifier, and then we just keep sampling, throw compute at it, which is like much cheaper because it's a smaller model. And then, if you find this right trade-off between how small or like weak the model is and like how much compute we use during inference time, and we kind of, optimize for the sweet spot, we can just like sample our way to surpassing even the frontier models that are much more expensive to run. But like this plot shows that this for resampling again, this actually doesn't hold. And then we can directly connect it to the plot on the right, which introduces sort of this like cost of false positive, like the cost and benefit of like a false positive solution versus like a true positive. And if we include that dynamics, then we even see that sampling an infinite number of times would not even be beneficial to you as a downstream user, because like your individual cost benefit trade-offs actually suggest that the optimal number of samples is oftentimes, here you see the x-axis, much lower than 10 for a model like Llama 3.17 TP, for example, here on the coding benchmarks. Yeah, so this is kind of the intuition behind those plots, behind these main findings of the paper. And I think, it's a neat thing because it kind of is eye-opening how kind of these small imperfections in the verifier, like, it has still like a precision of like, higher than 90%. So it's still a really good verifier, but these small sort of imperfections, let's say, introduce these dynamics that are actually sort of like that make it very hard to do inference scaling through, for example, using that verifier through, for example, resampling. But I quickly want to actually get back to like one point that you mentioned, which is like this promise of like increasing accuracy to just like in this like simple setup that almost seems like too simple to be true. Like we just keep sampling solutions and then like we find passing to like better and better things, and we can increase accuracy that way. But this is actually something that comes out of like the AlphaCode paper. I think it's the first sort of instantiation of that where I've seen it. Like it's a DeepMind paper from I think 2019. Like, okay, this might be wrong, but like it's a couple years old already now, and they showed that it actually holds that we can improve accuracy by just repeatedly sampling from the same model over multiple orders of magnitude, over 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. Kind of the coverage, like the accuracy of the model kind of improves log linearly. So like there's a linear increase with like exponential numbers of more samples. And that of course assumes that we have like an Oracle verifier. So right, like so once we sampled a correct solution, like we're indeed able to identify it. So this is kind of where the reality kicks in, but it's truly, I think, remarkable that this actually holds over multiple orders of magnitude. And like even from a small model, if you just keep sampling, at some point it spits out a correct solution for like, these kinds of problems. And there's other papers that have shown the same things in different domains. And so this is kind of what motivated thinking about, oh, we just need a verifier and then we can basically solve any problem. For math, this has, there are papers that show that you can come up with like, new proofs for unsolved math problems, but just, keep sampling and like have a verifier, like an Oracle verifier from like an automated proof system, for example, automated proofer. And we have found like new solutions that are super cool papers out there that show that this actually works in practice.
I just wanted to quickly respond to some of that, and because I did think that this notion of like once you think about the cost benefit of of having, once you incorporate that into your thinking about whether or not it makes sense to continue sampling, that implies that in certain scenarios the optimal number of samples might not actually be very high. I found that to be very very striking, because oftentimes in these resampling papers, it's like 100 samples, 1,000 samples, what have you. But if some of those orders of magnitude might not even be relevant if the cost of these false positives is sufficiently high, and in some sense that makes a lot of sense in that on some level one of the points of your paper is that there are these other costs that you need to kind of take into account when we talk about scaling laws and the benefits of scaling. And one of the things that you actually kind of get at in a kind of roundabout way is that in some sense of the verifier has a cost to it. Sampling obviously has a cost to it in terms of compute, but the verifier has a cost too. Even if you had a zero compute cost verifier, the fact that the LLM may still have these kind of like false positives, in some sense, imputes a cost to using that verifier, in practice,
Yep.
which is kind of like an interesting idea. And the other thing I was thinking about as I was just sort of preparing for this conversation is like, another way to kind of think about it is that is sort of like some of these ideas from like signal processing and like signal to noise ratio, where you can almost think about the verifier as being a filter, like in a signal processing context. And the quality of the verifier to some extent corresponds to the quality of that filter in terms of its ability to extract signal from noise. And these LLMs are kind of generating this noisy distribution of responses to any given like question or task. And the fact that this verifier isn't perfect essentially like caps the maximum signal that you can kind of extract from that noisy data coming out of the LLM.
Yeah.
And more sampling from the LLM doesn't change that. It doesn't get you around that fundamental limitation of the verifier. Does that make sense, or am I just like off on a off on a tangent?
No, no, I think that I really like the metaphor. I've not thought about it in that way, but it's, I think, right on the spot. I think like both things that you said, the first thing with like, even if we would assume infinite compute, like basically let's say the compute is for free on both the generator and the verifier side, like we haven't even considered sort of like the compute cost of the verifier here. If you take into account sort of like that there will always be a cost attached to a false positive for a downstream user, right? Otherwise, like if there's no cost to a false positive, then we don't even need a verifier in the first place. So there will always be I think
Yeah.
it's a good assumption, like a perfectly fine assumption to make that there will be a cost of a false positive for a downstream user. And obviously there's some benefit, right? Otherwise they wouldn't even, like the user would not task an AI system with like coming up with a solution. So both of these things are definitely true. And once we take those into account, then even if compute is for free, the optimal number of samples and the limitations, let's say, with that number not being with that number being finite, the limitations of like this resampling, inference scaling through resampling technique are indeed like material and like are just in place. And like I think that with our paper we try to put in some figures and like explain why this is the case and like make it intuitive, even though it seems unintuitive on first sight. And like the second thing that you said is exactly right. So I think one, our paper is in line with like a number of other works, different inference scaling techniques that really motivate sort of like the necessity of getting stronger and better verifiers to basically make, models better, to make like, especially reasoning models better. And because we show that like if basically, as you perfectly like put into the right words, is like if you that the actual like limitation of what we can achieve is not on the generator side necessarily, but like on the verifier side. So then the verifier kind of poses this natural limit on how capable and our AI system, let's say, as the structure can be. And even that like these small sort of imperfections I mentioned earlier introduced on the verifier level can actually introduce these like really interesting dynamics that limit the overall value of doing like scaling more compute in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. Very very cool. Um, Awesome. I encourage everybody to read this paper. Again, I found it very striking and very interesting. And it's like one of those. like all good papers, it's like one of these things you wouldn't have necessarily intuited ahead of time, but then once you read it, you're like, oh, that makes complete sense. So that's always a sign of a great paper. There were some other topics that we wanted to cover.
Yeah, maybe let's get into the cybersecurity agents paper because that's something I'm personally extremely excited about. And it's like in line with like much of other work with my collaborators, mainly at Princeton, about like the work in agent evaluations that we do, and like really like the sort of like contributions we try to make there on the conceptual, but also of course on the benchmark and let's say more infrastructure side. Yeah, and kind of this paper is joint work led by Boy Wei at Princeton and like with a couple of other co-authors at Princeton. And what we kind of really tried to get there is that the cybersecurity as a domain is just actually very specific and has like some particularities, let's say, in evaluating sort of how good AI agents or like these AI systems are at finding cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And I'm getting into those like sort of particularities in a second. But basically, the motivation for the paper comes from the fact that with coding agents becoming, or language models in the first place, becoming better and better at coding and understanding systems and like complex networking infrastructure, right? These AI agents using those models also become better at, for example, spotting and exploiting potentially cybersecurity vulnerabilities. There's a bunch of really cool work out there, demonstrating that on the benchmarking side with something like Cybench from out of Stanford, um, and Intercode out of Princeton actually, and like a couple of other benchmarks, but also on the agent side with, for example, Enigma being a paper from again France at Princeton showing kind of how capable these agents on these benchmarks already are, and they can solve high school level like cybersecurity challenges. Like there are these like what is called like capture the flag challenge, which is used for basically like cybersecurity hackathons, where there is like these small sort of like handcrafted environments that usually involve that's hence the name some flag that the adversary needs to find in order to exploit the vulnerabilities. This might be like some hidden message, like an encryption challenge, or some like some part of the code where there is, let's say, a password exposed or something like that, and then the password would be the flag. These are two like very simple examples, but this is kind of what a capture the flag challenge usually describes. And like these agents, such as Enigma, for example, can actually solve like high school level challenges, so challenges that are used for like high school competitions in cybersecurity. So if you kind of play that out, and while like the current limit like capabilities are still limited, if you think that like these capabilities will increase in the future, of course, like this natural risk and safety risk emerges, where people can basically at very little cost deploy agents, let's say, to find vulnerabilities on the web, right? Like just like spawn potentially hundreds of thousands of agents and like basically explore for a given target, or even just like completely targetless where potential vulnerabilities on web servers, companies, etc. are, and then because they're already capable at like also exploiting them, literally like exploit them in an autonomous, potentially automated way, and that's of course like a huge cybersecurity risk. Quick side note: there's also work on like using those same agents to kind of improve the defense strategies of like cyber systems, which is also a super exciting direction. But like we focused on sort of the attack scenario here. But what we wanted to understand is kind of how can we evaluate and basically almost think of it as like a tripwire sort of like early warning signal these sort of cybersecurity agents, and what is the right way to really get a good estimate on their like upper bound accuracy, their upper bound capability, so that we know kind of when they get like strong enough to like really be sort of a danger in the open. And the thing that makes it sort of hard and different from other domains are like these two things basically, and that is the first that we talked about verifiers, so that's where this paper connects to the previous work. For cybersecurity tasks, we oftentimes actually know when we found and exploited a vulnerability correctly. So like there is like sort of this natural verifier that usually people can use. An example of that might be, like let's say there is some sort of like encrypted message stream, and like the adversary tries to kind of decrypt that and like tap into that sort of information. Then of course, as soon as like they found the right like way to break the encryption, and they can decrypt the message, and like it suddenly makes sense, and like it's something that's it's text, that is like a natural language, then you automatically know that you actually succeeded in decrypting that. For another example is like if you try to break in, if you do like a code injection attack right on like some website to try to bring it down, then of course if the website goes offline, you know that like yeah, you succeeded in like exploiting that sort of vulnerability. So the verifier is there, which just as we discussed before is like already very useful in like increasing the accuracy of a system, because you can just like retry basically and use the verifier as a raw signal. And the second one is that in order to do that, an adversary needs to have the right incentives, right? It needs to have enough compute budget, enough financial sort of resources to actually do the inference scaling, and let's say spend like thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, let's say, on like doing inference with models. And that in cybersecurity is also naturally true, because like there's really shocking statistics out there showing kind of how much money businesses lose just from like defending and kind of reconciling the effects of cyber attacks on their systems. So for adversaries, this is a very lucrative sort of thing, right? Like obviously to kind of coerce, let's say, companies in with like having exploited their cyber systems, and also for companies like on the defensive side, let's say there's a high incentive to spend a lot of money defending against these sort of attacks. So these two things are true, and with that inference scaling and like doing self-training, having sort of self-improving agents becomes possible, because we have a reward signal and we have a strong incentive to spend compute on improving these systems. And with that, like having sort of these static evaluations that we do for other domains such as coding or web agents doesn't really make sense anymore, because like the upper bound is truly higher than what we measure with like a pass at one or something on some CTF benchmark. Because like there is this way for the adversary to have these degrees of freedoms, let's say, to increase the accuracy in these various axes that we mentioned in the paper, such as inference scaling, self-training, self-refinement, to improve accuracy, and with that get a much higher number that we wouldn't even have measured if we only look at like pass at one and don't consider these sort of dynamic assessments of risk as we name them in the paper.
Something you mentioned that I just thought was funny was a high school level hacking challenge, which I don't know. Maybe you went to a really cool high school. They didn't teach us any hacking in my in my high school. I think in my computer science class, if you could build like a linked list, you got an A. But like, it wasn't anything more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I did learn about some techniques when I was teaching myself to code as a kid, like SQL injection and whatnot. But those are all kind of like self study. But anyways, I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, so
Um,
what I meant with like high school level competitions is actually there is this cool organization. I think it's called Pico CTF, to be honest. Yeah, picoctf.org, and it's basically comes out of Carnegie Mellon. And what they're doing is they kind of built this platform where high schools and anyone who kind of wants to can host sort of capture the flag hackathons, challenges, like do a learning unit in their classes for, I think, predominantly like high schoolers, and like host these sort of competitions, and they provide sort of the challenges, like the actual environments and like a little bit of the structure around it. And I know that people build a benchmark out of these challenges of that platform, and kind of to benchmark the first iteration, the first the first generation of like cybersecurity agents. And this is the intercode benchmark that I just mentioned. So like the accuracy that we get on that is kind of on high school level CTF challenges. But of course, I'm not saying that every high schooler needs to be able to solve these sort of challenges.
yes, yes. And you mentioned this notion that in some of these kind of cybersecurity contexts, you can get what is essentially a pretty good or perfect even verifier, because there's maybe some piece of information that you can only have gotten if you manage to hack the system or whatnot. I guess one thing that's kind of interesting about that in the cyber context is sort of like you can verify that the system has been compromised. You can never verify that the system couldn't be compromised. In other words, like verifying the defense is a lot harder than verifying the successful attack.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gets to this notion of like I was at this AI conference back in December of last year, and there was this one session on AI cybersecurity, and actually one of my previous guests, Daniel King, was at this conference, and he studies this topic as well, and this notion of whether AI net helps benefit or benefits attackers or defenders more kind of came up, and different people had different thoughts, but there was definitely like a general bias of most people there. I'd be curious, based off this research and your own thinking, like, do you think that AI and its abilities generally benefits attackers more or defenders more?
Hmm. No, that's a good question, and I'm not claiming I have a great answer on that, but my 2 cents are maybe that like in even in the before, let's say, AI ages, this sort of race, right? Like don't want to call it an arms race, but like this race of like using new technology to increase like to improve defenses, but also using like oftentimes the same technologies to kind of increase the capabilities of the attacker was always true there, and the guy is basically just the next iteration of that sort of thing. I think in general, attacking is always easier than defending because like an attacker just needs to find one way, a defender needs to find all the ways, right? Like it's like a harder problem. There's like some nice analogy, I think, from adversarial machine learning. Maybe like people like have heard of like this example in like where we like this like gibbon versus panda. So you have like an image classifier, like a model that takes in images and classifies sort of which animals in there, and then you can actually add random noise to that image that is like not perceptible to the human eye, but that confuses the classifier to like misclassify, let's say, the panda into as a gibbon or something like that. And like finding this sort of like, of course, that and like there was this whole sort of years of research on basically coming up with defense mechanisms against these sort of like noise injection attacks. Um, but yeah, there was always kind of another loophole, another way, at least as far as I know about this line of research, another loophole of basically again tricking and like overcoming and like evading the defense mechanism. So like again, I would say given that an attacker needs to find one way of tricking the defenses or like finding a loophole, but the defender needs to basically patch and fix all of the possible ways. If it just seems like a simpler problem to me intuitively. So I think kind of maybe if let's assume AI helps both sides equally, I think at least in the short term, the attacker will always have this like short like disadvantage to some extent because it's a simpler problem.
Yeah, yeah, and that was how most of the people on the panel thought as well. Um, I do really like this idea of dynamic risk assessment as opposed to merely static risk assessment, and it kind of gets to that sort of like classic, whack-a-mole dynamic in security where you sort of patch one thing or you block one thing, and that just you know water. I forget what the quote is, but water finds its way downhill or something. But
Yeah.
and so it just kind of highlights the fact that as defenders the job is kind of never done, and it can only in some sense it can only be a tougher job than you think it is. However easy you think it is, it's probably tougher
Yeah.
to defend. I guess and again, it's not to pontificate, get you pontificating too much, but like what is to be done then? Because I mean, it sounds like as you mentioned, like attackers have multiple ways that they can kind of explore and exploit in order to attack a target. Naturally, kind of these various capabilities help attackers more than defenders. You know, is there anything that we can do on the defense side to kind of like prevent these vulnerabilities, or what can be done?
Yeah, I mean, I at least the answer to that, and like experts in like cybersecurity who kind of think about how to defend and prevent like all of these classes of sort of vulnerabilities and attack scenarios that are captured by these CTF benchmarks. I mentioned encryption, BAP as like two domains, but there's a couple other ones. But what I will say, what I can focus on is like I work on evaluations, AI agent evaluations, and like I think from the evaluation side, what is most useful to the cybersecurity experts, I think, is having a notion that they can trust of like how capable existing systems are out there, and like basically this is like is connected to this like notion of preparedness, of course, right, and like having sort of an early warning system for these like sort of safety critical domains. And I think what we as a community focus on like evaluations can do is like truly think about how can we provide that signal in the with the least noise possible? How do we kind of estimate this upper bound of like capabilities that current cybersecurity agents with the best models using as the backend have? And I think dynamic risk assessment, as you suggest in the paper, of like considering these degrees of freedoms of how an adversary, given some amount of compute, can improve the capability on a specific downstream task, is one I think very useful way already of getting most of the way there, of getting some sort of like upper bound early warning system evaluation. And I think that is what should become, as we suggest in the paper, the best practice for the cybersecurity domain. And I think with that kind of experts working on trying to understand like how much they already should focus on what kind of defense mechanisms to implement in their systems, they at least know what's coming, quote unquote, out there, and like what kind of where the current state of the art and capabilities are.
Yeah, I always love to hear that evaluations are important because I'm an investor in a evaluation company called Patronus AI. So brief plug there, but yeah, no, totally agree. It's sort of, I mean, in both these papers, as we kind of talked about, it all comes back to the verifier, the evaluator. There's something really kind of like fundamental there, and there's not really a way to get around that. Is kind of the takeaway in some sense.
Yeah, and I truly think that like another work that I'm working on is kind of the holistic agent leaderboard, HAL, which is kind of our third-party platform for AI agent evaluations of any kind. So we're not focusing on a specific domain, but we truly have that, hence the word holistic, um, benchmarks from all kinds of domains: science, coding, cybersecurity, web, and others. And with this platform, we truly try to make evaluations as useful as possible by kind of standardizing how they're run, having like this open source platform for like agent and benchmark creators to collaborate to kind of like for the benchmark side, add their benchmarks to the platform for agent developers to have a way to evaluate agents on the platform in a way that they know the numbers that are outputted by that are comparable to other numbers that they see. Because as we actually to talk about in another paper called AI Agents That Matter, like many of the findings, let's say in the early days of AI agents, were actually not really reproducible, and like it turned out that like they were also not really comparable because they were non-standardized. So people evaluated on different subsets of benchmarks and like with slightly different evaluation scoring code. So like it was all a little bit noisy. And that is truly one of the big challenges that we see in order to make AI evaluations useful. So we built this one-stop shop, basically this platform as an academic community to solve many of these issues. And I truly fully agree that I think evaluations and like high signal to noise, let's say, evaluations are truly what's lacking in much of the language space and also beyond. So building hard benchmarks that are construct valid, so they measure something that we are truly interested in, not some like slightly confused notion of capability, and then evaluated and scored, let's say, in a consistent, standardized way. These are like sort of the three steps or like three big pillars of what is kind of what makes a good evaluation, and like that and what's to some extent like is missing in many domains out there right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this, Benedict. Really enjoyed the conversation. These are super important topics, very timely topics, but also kind of like timeless in a certain sense. And so, thank you for the kind of contributions you're making, in these areas. And separately, super excited to see more from your new company. It sounds really interesting.
Thanks, Namdi. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and really enjoyed. It was a big pleasure kind of talking to you.
Of course. All right. Thanks, everyone.